रब इश्रह ली सदरी वयस्सिर ली अमरी वहलुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली। अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम। बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम। Assalamu alaikum. Let's start the brief explanation of the 28th para with the dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our hearts to the message of the Quran. Ameen. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Mujadila, which was revealed in the 5th Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is to expose the secret propaganda of the hypocrites. The surah begins with an incident of a Muslim woman who had come to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and shared her problem. The problem was pre-Islamic law of zihar. What is important for us is that this complaint of the woman was heard by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and a command was immediately sent to address the issue. We should also know that just as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala listened to her and solved her problem, He can do the same for us. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us of what else He listens to in verse number 7. Do you not see that Allah knows whatever is in the heavens and whatever is on the earth? If 3 converse privately, He is their 4th. If 5, He is their 6th. Whether few or more, He is with them wherever they may be. Then on the day of judgment, He will inform them of what they had done. Surely Allah has perfect knowledge of all things. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also listens to our conversations, even our private ones, in which we sit together, whispering to each other, ridiculing some and gossiping about others. This is called najwa, and it is disliked by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says in verse 10, secret talks are only inspired by shaitan to grieve the believers, yet he cannot harm them whatsoever except by Allah's will. So in Allah, let the believers put their trust. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 11, O believers, when you are told to make room in gatherings, then do so. Allah will make room for you in His grace. And if you are told to rise, then do so. Allah will elevate those of you who are faithful and raise those gifted with knowledge and rank. And Allah is all aware of what you do. Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving us these instructions? Shouldn't His concern be only with our ibadat, with roza and namaz kind of thing? No, Islam is a complete way of life. How to meet, greet, sit and talk are all included in it. Surah Al-Hashr. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Hashr, which was revealed in the 4th Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is about the hypocrites and their activities. The historical background of this surah is important to understand, as it was sent down concerning the battle against the Banu Nazir. Who were the Banu Nazir? They were among the most prominent Jewish tribes settled around Medina. The Jews were economically much stronger than the Arabs. They were mostly traders and also did flourishing business in granting amulets and charms, fortune telling and sorcery, but their chief occupation was trading in money lending. They also profited from the mutual wars among the Arabs. When Islam came and the Islamic state of Medina came into being, they had to suffer losses. Islam had made all Muslims brothers, so there was no infighting. Interest was made haram, so no money lending. Amulets, fortune telling and sorcery were also prohibited, so the Jews were worried about their future earnings and about losing their influence. This made them think of Muslims as their enemies. They broke their peace agreements with the Muslims, sided with the enemies, plotted with the hypocrites, and planned to kill Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Due to their hostile attitude, the Muslims laid a siege to them and they were finally banished from Medina. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us in verse number 7, whatever the messenger gives you, take it, and whatever he forbids you from, leave it, and fear Allah. Surely Allah is severe in punishment. We have to ask ourselves, when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam instructs us to do something, do we actually do it? And when He forbids us to do something, do we stop doing it? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes us among those who follow the sunnah. Ameen. In verse number 9, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those who are saved from their own soul's greed are truly successful. Our souls tell us only to care about ourselves and never concern ourselves with the need of others, but we need to fight our own selves and train our souls to think about others. Then verse number 10 tells us to clean our hearts towards others and to make dua for them. If there is something missing in your life, make dua for someone else who is also facing the same problem in life. Don't be selfish in your duas. You are asking the Lord of the worlds, and His treasures are unlimited. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 21, had we sent down this Quran upon a mountain, you would have certainly seen it humbled and torn apart in awe of Allah. Meaning, if a huge creation like a mountain had the sense that it had been made responsible and accountable before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it would have trembled with fear. But we humans are not bothered. We are unmoved at this responsibility. Surah Al-Mumtahana. let's take a look at the flowchart of microstructure of Surah Al-Mumtahina, which was revealed in either the 7th or the 8th Hijri in Medina. The central policy of the Islamic State and its citizens are this surah's central subject. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us instructions in this surah not to make close allies with those who are enemies of Islam. Then in verse 4, we are given the example of Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam, how he separated from his community and even his own father because he disbelieved in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and wanted him to leave his religion. Imagine how difficult it would have been for Hazrat Ibrahim alayhi salam to leave all his loved ones for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Verses 10 to 12 contain the citizenship and immigration laws about the Muslim women who wished to migrate to the Islamic State. The women who were accepting Islam had to be checked before allowing them to reside in Medina because it was possible that they were spies. They also had to take an oath of allegiance that they will not commit shirk, theft, adultery, murder of their children, slander, and disobedience of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Also, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given the law that Muslim women would not stay as wives with their disbelieving husbands. Surah As-Saf. Let's take a look at the flowchart of microstructure of Surah As-Saf, which was revealed in the 3rd Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is a call to become the helpers of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse number 2, O believers, why do you say what you do not do? This verse is so scary for anyone calling towards goodness because it is very easy to preach to others. Words are easy, right? To act upon them is difficult. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in verse 4 that He wants the people fighting in His way to be disciplined, well organized and united. They should be confident in their cause and should have the love and respect for each other. Next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse number 8, they wish to extinguish Allah's light with their mouths, but Allah will certainly perfect His light, even to the dismay of the disbelievers. No matter how much the enemies of Islam try, they can never defeat Islam. All the superpowers of the world can unite, but they can never take out the light of Iman from the hearts of Muslims. The light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will keep on shining and spread throughout the world. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in verse number 10 to 12 how to save ourselves from the ultimate loss. What would we need to do? Believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and strive in His path with our money, time, skills and whatever resources we have. If we do this, we will have the success of both worlds. Surah Al-Jumu'ah. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Jumu'ah, which was revealed in the 7th Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is to inform about the purpose of sending Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We are told in verse 2 that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam with this message so that he could purify us and teach us wisdom from his book. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then comments about the Jews in verse number 5. The example of those who are charged with Torah and then they fail to live up to it is that of a donkey laden with book. What is the meaning of this example? It means that those who have the knowledge and don't use it, either to benefit themselves or others, are like donkeys who are just bearing a weight which won't benefit them. Then the importance of the day of Friday is mentioned in verse number 9. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, believers, when the call for prayers is made on Friday, hasten to the remembrance of Allah and give up all trading. This is better for you if you only knew. Friday is the special day chosen by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for us. As Muslims, we must take special care and prepare for the Friday prayers. When the azan is called, all other activities should be stopped and the top priority should be to attend the khutbah and pray in the mosque. Surah Al-Munafiqun. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Munafiqun, which was revealed in the 6th Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is an advice to the Muslims to understand the different tricks of the hypocrites. The first 8 verses mention the characteristics of the hypocrites. They are liars. They take false oaths. They try to stop people from following the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They have good appearances, meaning they take care of how their outwards look. Their clothing, manner of speech gives the impression of a very honorable person. They are arrogant and think that they are better than others. Verses 9 to 11 give us the cure for hypocrisy. The cure is to keep remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and spend in His way. When we remember our Maker and our accountability before Him, then only will we stop doing wrong actions. Surah Al-Taghabun. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Taghabun, which was revealed in the 1st Hijri after the migration to Medina. Its central subject is that the success or failure on the Day of Judgment is the real success or failure. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 11, no disaster strikes except by permission of Allah, and whoever believes in Allah, He will guide his heart, and Allah is knowing of all things. Every trial, every test that comes to your life is by the permission and will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What our reaction should be? is to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us and give us the strength to bear the burden. Know that He will give you the strength and He will put something in your heart which will guide you through that problem. Later, when the test passes, you yourself would be surprised by the strength you showed during the trial. Verse 14. O you who have believed, indeed among your spouses and your children are enemies to you, so beware of them. But if you pardon and overlook and forgive, then indeed Allah is forgiving and merciful. When these verses were revealed, it was very common that a man would become a Muslim, but his wife and children would remain disbelievers and would try their best to press him to give up Islam. The problem you and I face today is not the pressure of giving up Islam, but to do other things which we know would displease Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes we are the ones who want our family members to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for some trivial worldly gain. Remember that before that person is your spouse or your son or your daughter, that person is the slave of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Surah At-Talaq. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah At-Talaq, which was revealed in the 7th Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is to observe the limits set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Surah Talaq speaks about the rulings of divorce, waiting period, and providing provision for the divorced women. In addition to giving commands, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keeps on reminding over and over to the believers to be mindful of Him and do not go over the boundaries. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 1, these are the limits set by Allah, and whoever transgresses Allah's limits has truly wronged his own soul. Divorces break families, so they are despised by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if the conditions are such that the steps has to be taken, then the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be strictly followed. The legal commands of Islam ensure justice and that the women and children are protected. I would strongly suggest that in these matters, the case should be taken to the people of knowledge so they would provide proper guidance. Surah Tahrim. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Tahrim, which was revealed in 8th or 9th Hijri in Medina. The central subject of this surah is that the limits set by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must be observed. Surah Tahrim begins with a reference to the incident where Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam prohibited upon himself something that was halal just to make his spouses happy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 1, O Prophet, why do you prohibit yourself from what Allah has made lawful for you, seeking to please your wives? And Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. This tells us that we can never make something haram for ourselves which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made halal. You can dislike something, but you cannot say that it is forbidden for you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 6, O believers, protect yourselves and your families from fire, whose fuel is people and stones. Learn about your deen and teach your children how to be good Muslims. You want the best for your loved ones, right? The best you can do for them is to protect them from the everlasting punishment of the hellfire. In the next verse, we are given the examples of 4 women, 2 disbelievers and 2 believers. What's surprising is that the 2 disbelievers are both wives of the prophets. One the wife of Hazrat Lut alayhi salam and the other the wife of Hazrat Nuh alayhi salam. This tells us that even if we belong to very righteous families, they won't be able to do anything for us if we ourselves don't live a life of righteousness. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us the example of Hazrat Asiya in verse number 11. And Allah sets forth an example for the believers. The wife of Pharaoh who prayed, My Lord, build me a house in paradise near you. Deliver me from Pharaoh and his evil doings and save me from the wrongdoing people. Imagine being the wife of the biggest disbeliever, a man who called himself God and still living her life as a believer. How strong her faith must have been. The other great lady this surah talks about is Hazrat Maryam alayhi salam, who guarded her chastity and raised a prophet as a single mother. This concludes our lesson for today and brings us to the question I'm going to ask myself. The question is, which woman is my role model and why? Inshallah, we will meet again tomorrow with the next para. Allah Hafiz.